Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hey guys, I hope everybody is doing well. So here I am again, another episode of the Ideal Investor Show is starting. And today I wanted to come back to one of the fundamental things that have to do with investing in real estate, especially residential real estate. And I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have heard about it. And that is when selecting real estate, one of the most important things is location, location, location. Right? That's a pretty old saying, but it has truth to it, even though you may have heard me say, yeah, location is important, but performance is more important. And I stick to that. But what I wanted to point out about location is when we're looking a little bit bigger picture about like the city, the county, or the state that we want to go into to invest, obviously we look for performance, but we also have to ask ourselves, why is something potentially performing? Why are the numbers looking the way they are? And what I mean by that is take, for example, a property, something like a 1,500 square foot house that is on the market offered to us for $150,000 to buy. On first glance, that sounds perfect, right? That meets our criteria. Now we go look and we find out, well, we want to get 1,500 in rent, but our systems and our tools show us that the rent we can get is only 1,100. Now, between you and me, you listening, I'm basically telling you, anybody who knows me, anybody who's looked at any of our articles or the website or the podcast or stuff, you know, if it doesn't get pretty close to 1%, meaning like 1,400, 1,450, 1,500 in rent, we won't touch it. But the question is, why is there a property that costs 150,000, which is a reasonable price for that size of a house, but it only gets 1,100 rent? And so I saw a statistic that was kind of interesting because it showed certain locations where people who invested in those locations really kind of got a raw deal or bad deal or whatever word you want to use. And what I found, what these locations have in common or seem to have in common, is a lot of them have only one really, really major employer or one really, really major thing going for them. And when that's no longer there, then the community is suffering, and therefore then also the real estate is suffering. You want to ask yourself, if there's one employer in these locations or one big one, is this employer a competitive company? Right, because the company may have been there for many, many, many years. I give you an example. If I lived for a while in Santa Fe, and I flew out of Albuquerque International Airport, so I always drove from Santa Fe to Albuquerque. And at the very end of my drive, before I reached the airport, I could always see this huge area up the hillside, which was very industrial. And, after a little while, I asked, okay, what is this stuff there on the right side when I drive to the airport? And people said, oh, that's the campus for Intel. And Intel had been there for decades and decades and decades, and they're making semiconductor chips there. And that was a great business decades ago, and it is a great business right now, and it is probably going to be a great business in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that Intel is running the business very well. If anybody has seen the report for the last couple of quarters, they haven't been running it very well. But at least they make computer chips that are competitive. So that answers that first question. Now, the second question is the employer, one of those big employers, investing and modernizing? Now, in this case, Intel has, with some government money, and this seems to be the theme these days, but they have received a whole bunch of billions of dollars of government money plus their own capital investment to modernize their fabrication locations, their factories basically, because they want to make better and better, more and more capable chips. So in that case, the answer would be yes. Now, the third question I think you should ask yourself, if you look at a location that has one single dominating employer, is the company growing, or is it basically reducing its workforce or not hiring anymore? In the case in Albuquerque, it wasn't really growing anymore. They had a lot of more automation, but the company was stable and they were regularly investing, and they are in a market that is, in a sense, future safe. And then the last question is, when you look bigger picture, like if we were to, for example, look at Albuquerque, are people moving in or are people moving out? And in this case, I can say Albuquerque has been growing, not rapidly like places in Texas, but steadily. Because it is a nice place. I mean, don't get me wrong, I really always like the city and it's growing and it's nice and so forth. So it makes sense that people move there, but it's also important that the employers that actually offer jobs there are stable employers. And one of the big things in Albuquerque is also the military. So it's not just Intel, just to make sure. Now, I give you a few examples that this article that I had read actually gave for cities where people invested in and really kind of got a raw deal. One of them is Atlantic City, New Jersey. Now, what comes to mind when you hear Atlantic City, New Jersey? For me, at least, the first thing that comes to mind is gambling. Kind of in a way like Las Vegas. Well, one of the things that they did wrong there is that they didn't modernize their stuff. If you look at Atlantic City and you look at Las Vegas, it basically feels like two different worlds. Right? Now, the other thing that also plays a huge role is New Jersey as a state has kept increasing taxes of all kinds, which has led to one phenomenon besides the gambling, and that is that people that lived there more and more moving out and going to other places. I know of quite a few who actually moved to Florida because Florida doesn't have income tax. And New Jersey has high income tax and high property tax and high sales tax. If the gambling isn't modern and competitive any longer and is basically not in any way comparative to Las Vegas, for example, and it's really expensive on a taxation perspective to live there, that makes sense that people move away. Another cities that are on that list in the article I refer to, places like Youngstown, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana. Does anybody know what bell that should ring? So I tell you, the large employer with these towns are automotive companies. And as you may have seen, automotive companies are really, really struggling, especially the GMs and the Fords and the Chryslers, or what's called Stellantis of the world right now, because they kind of missed the boat on transitioning from the regular type of car to electric cars. And you know I'm a Tesla fanboy, and I know that electrification of cars is not anywhere large scale yet. I think in the United States it's 7 or 8% and 93% is still regular cars. But to make the transition, you have to basically start early because it's probably going to take 10 or 15 years. And they missed the boat. And so what do they have to do when we have times where everything is expensive, inflation is high, and people are struggling to pay for anything? One of the things they're not buying is new cars, regardless whether they're electric or not. So these companies, like in Gary, Indiana, and Youngstown, Ohio, have massively reduced employment, have oftentimes started laying off people, or when they had originally planned to make new investments, they stopped those new investments. And if there's no other employer in the area, what do? You have no other choice than moving out. And then there's another example I want to bring just to show that it's not just a matter of who is the large employer in the area. Most people in the United States have probably heard about Flint, Michigan, and that whole huge scandal about the water system. The thing that is also striking is that Flint, Michigan has a 35% poverty rate. Right, meaning like 35% of the people live below the poverty line by the definition of the Commerce Department. Those are some of the indicators that you want to look at, because in any one of these places that I just mentioned, you can find probably pretty attractive looking properties. But what they would also be is, and here's the thing why I said it is really tricky, if there's only like one major employer, you may have been able a few years ago to buy these properties for $150,000 and get the $1,500 rent. But when the GMs and the Fords and the Chryslers of the world start letting people go, or no longer invest, or reduce their workforce, and people move away, then there are less and less and less people who are willing and able to pay $1,500. And that's when you then come in and say, okay, I want to re-rent my house because my tenants moved away. We won't get the $1,500 anymore. And that's where this comes in, where you had paid $150 and now you're only getting $1,100. So the economic stability of your property and the area around your property is immensely important. And that is a significant component of performance. So when I say the most important thing of an investment property is performance, that is one of the questions to ask. How many large employers are there so that the people, my tenants that move into my investment property, have a place to work? Or are they all dependent on a company? And if so, what kind of company is it, and how competitive and how modern and how active and how attractive is it to bring more people into town? So take those into consideration. Don't just look at the numbers and say, today I can buy this thing for 150,000, I get the 1,500 in rent, which is one of our starting criteria, but also look at what will it most likely be in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Now, we don't know for sure that a single employer or even a strong economic base in a location will be there for 20 years. But you can probably tell if a company is good to go for the next 5 years. That should be the minimum for you to decide, do I want to be in there and invest in this location or not? So I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear any kind of questions or comments that you have. So please go to idealinvestorshow.com and book a call to discuss it. But also, if you don't want to do that, if you're not up for talking, then please go to Apple Podcast and give us a rating and a review on Spotify, because it really, really helps the show if you show that you're engaged with this and that you like it, or even if you don't like it, but do something, take action. And if you like to talk, I would love to talk to you, so book a call and let's have a conversation. That's it for this one. Be well and stay safe, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.